You're listening to dialectradio.co.uk.
Now, the book's called Broadcast News. The author, Patrick Chalmers, and he's joining me on the line now from the continent. Whereabouts are you, Patrick?
I am in southwest France, about an hour south of Toulouse, towards the Pyrenees.
It sounds nice. Is it quite warm down there?
It's pretty warm today, yes.
And how far are you from the Med?
A couple of hours.
Lovely.
By car.
Sounds nice. Anyway, are you British originally?
I am British, yeah, that's right.
And how have you ended up down there in France? And what's your trajectory? Because I know you were working as a journalist here in the UK.
Yeah, I was working, actually not just in the UK, I was working in Brussels and out in Malaysia for a while in London. And I suppose as a journalist, I was in London, moved to Brussels as a freelance, and then joined Reuters there, the news agency, for a while. Back to London, covered financial markets with Reuters, went out to Malaysia with them for a few years, 3 years, after the financial crisis in Malaysia. That was 1997 or so. Then back to London, and when I negotiated a redundancy from Reuters in 2005, I moved with my family out to France.
What about working for these big news agencies? How did you find it?
Well, that's what the subject, I suppose, the thread of Fraudcast news is actually Fraudcast news rather than broadcast news, because it's criticising the journalism industry as well as politics in general. How I was working for big journalism, I, on the way in, thought of it as my dream job to go and become a foreign correspondent for someone like Reuters. And I gradually decided that it wasn't at all what I'd imagined it would be.
So why was that? I mean, it does sound like a dream job, doesn't it? You're going all different parts of the world and also meeting some of the most interesting, rich and powerful people.
Well, the motivation obviously wasn't just to go abroad or meet rich and powerful people. It was, I suppose it was my version of somehow or other contributing something to society, and I fancied doing that using journalism. So in my own tiny way, contributing to that. And as I got a bit more experienced with journalism, having, as most journalists, sort of battled my way to actually get into a salaried job, I found that it wasn't so much that. It was far more to do sort of pro forma news, which was pretty much supporting the status quo. It wasn't really looking under the rug a great deal, and it was parroting for and against positions on any number of different topics, and it wasn't really breaking any particular stories that were helping society move forward, which perhaps naively I was thinking was the job of a journalist.
Well, it sounds to me like you weren't really questioning things enough. Are there any stories that you covered where you thought, actually, no, I don't think we did a very good job on that?
Very much so. I think probably the thread through the book was climate change. I was hired by Reuters in 94, I think it was, in Brussels. And at the time I was, amongst other things, their environment correspondent, covering what I suppose was the start of global negotiations on climate change. And I went to Kyoto to cover the big talks, the end of year global talks on climate change. There was, at the time, what seemed a very hopeful deal in which the rich countries in the world actually sounded as if they were going to do things. And then that rapidly unraveled. And as a journalist, what I felt is that we were doing a very poor job of covering the behind the scenes. So getting underneath why it was that the deal was unraveling, who was undermining the deal, who benefited from the deal falling apart. And also the gathering question for me was the exact legitimacy of elected politicians to negotiate on things such as this. There's a huge power imbalance in global negotiations on climate change. The rich countries, by and large, created the problem, and yet they were blocking any sort of real fundamental solution.
Well, you know what would be really frustrating is if you could see ways that things should be critiqued, but there was no opportunity given for you to write about them. So at least now you've done the Fraudcast news book. Sorry to get it wrong at the beginning. It's obviously it's a play on broadcast news. But what lessons did you learn about these climate change talks that you have been able to relate in the book? You know, something, I suppose, to help people understand what was really going on.
I mean, obviously, climate change is horrendously complicated, and I'm adding another layer, which is a media analysis of climate change. The basic problem was that the coverage was very superficial. So you would have a sort of fight between the United States and the European Union, and then a fight between the rich countries and the poor countries. The poor countries wanted the rich countries to do more and to undertake bigger cuts in order to give them money to offset the damage that the rich countries had been responsible for. And we would do, as journalists, the sort of Punch and Judy fight over that. But we weren't really going into issues such as economic growth, which is still an idea that is pretty much unquestioned by both mainstream politicians and mainstream journalists. If you look from an environmental perspective at economic growth, we live on a finite planet. Economic growth is an artificial construct of economists. It's not based in reality. Nature doesn't do compound growth over years and years like the economists say we need. Nature does cycles. You have like the cycle of the year. You have spring, summer, autumn, winter, and things grow and then fall back. They give fruit and then they rest. Economic growth is like cancer. It's like an epidemic, and you're asking for compound interest over years and years. And the scale of things now, we look at things on a global level, it's clear that that is no longer possible. And when I was at Reuters, and in fact, were I still to be at Reuters and many other places as well, if you start questioning things like economic growth, they think you're some sort of lentil munching hippie, you're sort of close to crazy and get back to your day job sort of thing.
Now, that sounds like groupthink that George Orwell wrote about in 1984. Are there any other areas you think that these big news wires, these big news agencies have groupthink on?
It's not just the news agencies. It's pretty much all mainstream journalism. If you look at the UK general election just passed, for example, it was an incredibly staged event. There was the campaign, which was very closely controlled by the main parties. And we have a result which has given us a majority government on the basis of about 25% of the eligible voting population, who can do pretty much everything they want. They have a majority with which to govern. And the idea that going forward for the next 5 years, that government is treated as if it's a legitimate representation of UK public opinion is bordering on farcical, if you ask me, but it's treated as totally everyday run-of-the-mill by any number of the mainstream press and certainly the international news agencies as well. And what's true for the United Kingdom is true for any so-called representative democracy anywhere in the world. There is the theatre of election, and then there's the day-to-day decision-making, which the professionals do, and they do it way beyond the influence and without really any accountability to ordinary citizens. If you want to get journalists to write about that, that's into polemic territory. That's what you're called. It's a lack of subjectivity, a lack of objectivity, I'm sorry. And that's not what journalists do. But in fact, that's what ordinary people think, and ordinary people are bang on the money as far as that's concerned.
What about some of the other big stories like the Middle East, the Ukraine, Greece and their bailout at the moment? What do you think? There's some groupthink going on there too?
Very much so. In fact, groupthink it's good that you talk about George Orwell, because George Orwell pretty much nailed it in 1984. That's obviously unfortunate in the sort of fictional novel, but it contains a great deal of truth. The likes of Noam Chomsky today is a US academic based in MIT. He writes about the problems of effectively media capture. Media are an arm of the status quo of elite thinking. So they don't really challenge the people who pay them. They don't really differ from the people they're reporting on. So if you look at any of those stories you've just talked about, whether it's Syria, the Middle East, whether it's Greece, for example, you are getting, by and large, the groupthink coverage of the issue. Greece, let's take for an example. Greece is not only what could kindly be called a fiscal waterboarding of the Greek people. It is also told in a very narrow corridor. There are all sorts of truths that link the Greek story back to the financial crisis of 2008, the massive bailout of private multinational banks at public expense, the bailout of French and German banks at the expense of the Greek people, the idea that no one in the 28-country European Union is really getting a chance to say anything about what's going on with the imposition of austerity, which in fact, as Paul Krugman, the US economist, has said, doesn't actually work anyway, but the imposition of austerity on the Greek people. So there's a total lack of democracy, which in terms of real popular accountability for what's going on in this whole Greek story. And that lack of accountability runs through pretty much everything. And yet it's not tackled by journalists generally. Journalists generally go to the press conference with the Prime Minister, with the opposition, maybe the CBI, maybe they got down to an ordinary person at the bottom of the story, or perhaps a union leader. But in terms of the accountability for what these people are doing in our so-called in our name, there's no getting beneath the skin of it. You get the odd standout journalist who does it, so they do exist. But by and large, the huge wave of day-to-day, wall-to-wall news is very much the status quo, which means that most people are not given the opportunity or don't even think to look beyond the headlines and look beyond the sort of this superficial blah, blah that they're offered through every channel they should open up.
Now, you're painting a picture of a kind of media warfare with the public as the target. I mean, is that me exaggerating? And also, if that is the case, who's benefiting from all this?
Well, you can look at the last sort of 30 years or so in terms of wealth distribution. You could easily see what the Occupy Wall Street and its various versions around the world have been calling the 1% versus the 99%. More accurately, it's more like the 0.1% versus the 99.9%. The disparity between that 0.1% and the rest of the planet has got massively worse over those last 30 years. So who's benefiting? Call it coincidence, call it the reality, call it the plan. Those people are definitely benefiting, and ordinary people, the squeezed middle and the poor, are definitely not benefiting.
Is it easy enough to get hold of a copy of sorry, I said it again, didn't I? Fraudcast news, not broadcast news.
It is, yeah. First of all, it's about democracy. And as far as I'm concerned, democracy is an incredibly important subject. So I decided, because I decided also to publish the book myself, that if you want it and you don't want to pay for it, you can download a free PDF. So if you go to fraudcastnews.net and sort of look around some of the buttons there, you can download a free PDF copy for nothing and read it on a screen or print it off. You can look it up on your favorite online bookselling channel, and you can tap it in, Fraudcast News and my name, Patrick Chalmers, and you'll get a copy. I would encourage people to go off the booksellers that sound like a Brazilian rivers and go to independent booksellers if they can. If you go into a bookstore and order it, it has an ISBN number, so you can order it through your local bookshop as well.
Patrick, I suppose the final question has got to be, where is this all heading? Are we going to actually have some sort of revolution in media where they start actually telling the truth for the whole population rather than just the 1%?
It's a really good question, Tony. I actually think that there are quite a lot of what are called independent media out there nowadays. I look at sites like particularly Democracy Now!, which is a reader-funded site in the States, which publishes every weekday an hour-long broadcast. There's plenty of sort of lower key sites here and there, and you need to dig them out. So in a way, the cover is already being lifted, and the conventional news under pressure of financial models are having to shift a bit. But it's not going to be the conventional news organizations that are going to be the big change makers. Reuters is mainly paid for by banks and financial institutions. There is not going to be a fundamental examination of financial markets running or playing merry hell with the rest of the planet by Reuters, because it's not their job. They're not being paid to do that.
OK, Patrick Chalmers, thanks very much for joining us on Dialect.
Thanks for having me, Tony.
You're listening to dialectradio.co.uk.